So this is the Panasonic S5IIX, and the first time I saw the specs on this camera was at the S5 II launch event.
This is the S5 Mark IIX.
And if you had told me just looking at those specs that this was some $5,000 to $10,000 cinema camera, I would have believed you. 6K video, open gate, internal ProRes, external RAW, you have anamorphic lens support, unlimited recording, and then you combine that with photo features that, again, just kind of rival cameras that are way more expensive. And if that doesn't make you want this camera, it actually should, because there are some massive features there that are just completely unmatched, especially for a camera that is just as good at taking photos. So let's kind of break down these 7 absolutely epic features that are so good, they're probably going to make you jealous if you don't already have this camera. And if you're going to be buying it or own it already, I actually put together a list of all of my favorite gear, lenses, gimbals, SD cards, everything you need for the S5 II and S5 IIX. So definitely check that out. All right, so number 1 of these epic features is going to be resolution, and that's really just the start. So this camera, it has 6K video in 10-bit up to 30 frames per second and 4K video up to 60 frames per second, although there is a crop in 4K 60. But the best part is that you can shoot 6K in the standard 16:9, you have DCI 17:9, and a 3:2 aspect ratio. And 3:2 is actually going to be native to the sensor, which is pretty insane, because if you think about it, every camera, or pretty much every hybrid mirrorless camera sensor, is going to be 3:2. So when you record that 16:9 wide video on most cameras, you're just losing the top and the bottom of the sensor. It's not being recorded. But in the S5 IIX, you're not only getting that entire width, the 6K width of the sensor, you get all of the vertical resolution as well. So for example, I can take a 6K horizontal video and still get a 4K vertical frame for like YouTube Shorts and IG from it. Plus, if you need to like punch in or reframe in post, which I do pretty often in these YouTube videos, you just have so much more room in post from all that extra resolution and the 3:2 aspect ratio. And there are actually 10 pages of different resolutions and frame rate combos, which is absolutely crazy. Thankfully, you can filter these, or I have a favorites list. You can just add something to your favorites and it'll sit in there. And just the fact that you even need a favorites list for all of these formats is super awesome. But honestly, by itself, this is probably a good enough reason to pick up this camera, but there's a whole lot more going on here. So number 2 is going to be codecs and formats, and there are a lot. You have H.264, H.265, you have all-eye recording, you have ProRes internal recording, you have ProRes external recording to a USB-C hard drive, you have full RAW support via HDMI out for ProRes RAW with the Atomos recorders, or B-RAW to Blackmagic recorders, and that has to make this like the most codecs of any camera I can think of in this price range, and probably by a lot, especially if you compare this to hybrid cameras, just cameras that work just as well for stills as video. And there are a few reasons that this is going to be a massive thing. So first of all, you get to choose, like, do you want to save on file size? Do you want the maximum quality? Do you want the best flexibility in post? So H.265, which is what I use the most, that's going to be the smallest file size and still great quality. But you can throw that into all-eye recording. You'll have less compression. You'll have 600 megabits per second internally, or 800 megabits per second externally via USB-C to an external hard drive. So you can actually record these onto hard drives that are just ready to edit off of. And by the way, Panasonic does have a list of recommended and tested SSDs. I've also tried a couple myself and they seem to work well. So I'll include all of these in the gear list that I recommend for this camera. And ProRes is a really great format to work with, especially if you're on Mac, because it plays back so well, it edits so well, and the quality is amazing. The only issue is that it chews through hard drive space like crazy. So definitely stock up on those, and I'll throw a link to like my favorite drives in the description. Also, you can shoot RAW externally, and I don't use like external recorders like this setup right here all too often, but the Panasonic S5 IIX is just one of those few cameras that can do this in RAW to ProRes RAW via the Atomos recorder, or Blackmagic RAW if that's your preference. And this will give you the ability to change things like white balance, ISO, and you'll just get the most flexibility for grading in post. So next up, we got to talk anamorphic lenses. And I personally don't use anamorphic lenses all that often, but I do have a ton of friends who do. And I met up with Josh Yo in Japan, and hopefully you've seen his channel. It's Make Art Now, and it is absolutely incredible. He shoots anamorphic like crazy, and I was able to get some insane shots using some anamorphic lenses with the S5 II. And this is something that very few other cameras can do, because ideally you want like a 4:3 or a 3:2 aspect ratio, especially with 6K recording. That can be ideal. And you also want some form of like de-squeeze in camera. And this has 5 options for de-squeezing depending on the actual format of lens that you're using. Plus you can use that with ProRes or RAW output to an external recorder. So the options for this camera and anamorphic lenses are just amazing. Now, if you've never shot Panasonic before, there is something that you're definitely missing out on, and that is customization and features. And I know a lot of cameras these days have a good amount of customization, but trust me, if you're not used to what you get on a Panasonic camera, the features and ergonomics as well are just next level. So there are absolutely just so many things that you can change on this camera. So you have a Q menu, which again gives you access to like 12 different custom settings, and these can be different between photo and video. Plus you have this scroll wheel on the back, which is also a D-pad. And what that means is that all 4 of those directions are fully customizable. And what's great is that I'll typically like just kind of leave these to not do anything. And then if I'm at a shoot and I find myself wanting to change a setting, you can literally just hold down the button for 3 seconds and then you can customize it. You set up a customization for that button just right on the spot. And you can actually do that with any button. So you just hold it down for 3 seconds and quickly you can customize it. So like yesterday, I was out shooting a car and this was going to end up on IG. So in 10 seconds, I just really quickly held down that button and recorded it, or set a customization to do a vertical frame marker so that I could just press the top button and see my framing for vertical, press it again if it got annoying and I just wanted to go back to the horizontal frame, and just toggle it on and off. You can even customize the look of the quick menu, which is insane. And then there's also this touchpad, which again, you can turn all of this off if you don't want to use it, but let's say you have the camera kind of rigged up and you don't really have access to some of these buttons, or it's on a tripod and you don't want to shake the camera by actually pressing these buttons or turning the dials. You can customize this to have on-screen buttons so you can change the shutter, aperture, ISO, and you can customize a lot of these options as well. And then you can do it all from the touch screen. And plus you just have solid ergonomics on this camera. You can dial things in just so perfectly that it makes you not want to use anything else, because there are just so many really useful features on this that you just won't find on anything else. But this next one is probably my favorite. IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, on this camera is just exceptional. Now there's really 2 parts to this. So one is just how effective the system is, how much room there is for the sensor to kind of move around and compensate for all the shake. And the other one is going to be the algorithms and just how the camera processes that shake and then converts that into really smooth looking footage. And this is where Panasonic just excels. Everything from this camera is just so smooth and so good, and noticeably better than pretty much every other camera on the market, especially full frame. And it might just be that I drink like 5 cups of coffee before lunch, but I cannot handhold a Sony camera and make it look good. It just doesn't look great. Now, Sony gets around this by having an active stabilization mode, by really just cropping into the frame and giving it a little bit more room for stabilization. But that means that your wide angle lens isn't as wide angle anymore. And I just think that Panasonic's IBIS just looks really incredible, looks really smooth. It's just one of the few cameras that gives you just a perfect handheld look without having to rig it up. This is just one of my favorite IBIS systems on any full frame camera. Now, I do happen to live in Florida, which probably makes this next feature really critical, But I think most people have seen just overheating or record limits like crazy on a lot of cameras, especially recently. If you want something that'll record in the sun for more than an hour, you're gonna have to go to a cinema-line camera or this one. So Panasonic has actually stuffed in an active cooling system in this camera. It's actually right up here where the flash is, and this doesn't affect like actual build or water resistance or anything, but there are some gaps right in here where the fan can breathe. And this means that there are no record limits. It's one of the few cameras that I haven't overheated. And overall, the build on this camera, it's just exceptional. And it's hard to show off like just on camera, but even just the screen mechanism, like this feels so good compared to a lot of my other cameras. If you're shooting video especially, this is probably going to be one of the most reliable cameras or the most reliable full frame camera you can get at this price point. But I do want to talk about photography because I know we talk about video all the time. I think that this is really where the S5IIX kind of blows away the competition, is in this kind of configuration. But remember, like this is a hybrid camera, so it does just as well for photo and video, and you don't have to rig it out at all to get that. So this is really what separates the S5IIX as well from a lot of the more video-centric cameras. So you're gonna get a full-frame 24 megapixel sensor, you have a mechanical shutter, you have 9 frames per second in mechanical continuous shooting, or 30 frames per second if you throw that into electronic shutter. You have dual card slots, you have a viewfinder that's actually really good. It's impressively large and 3.6 million dots. And then there's gonna be a high resolution mode, which will actually stack 8 images on top of each other to create a 96 megapixel RAW or JPEG file. And again, like these are features that you can sometimes find in other cameras, but absolutely nothing, probably under $3,000, is going to have these features. And speaking of $3,000, here's a bonus feature of the S5IIX, and that's going to be the price. And honestly, when Panasonic announced it, I thought it was going to be somewhere like $2,500, maybe closer to $3,000 for this model, kind of the video centric with all of these formats. It's $2,199 in the US, which is really crazy. Plus, I did some side-by-side lens comparisons with Sony and Canon. They're a lot cheaper than some of the competition. And literally, this is just the beginning. I have another video coming out on this camera just showing off more of the camera itself, more footage from the camera, the autofocus performance, image quality, low light, dynamic range, or you can check out my video on the standard S5 II. So make sure you're subbed for that. And there are just so many features that I didn't even mention. This has in-camera LUTs, you have waveforms, you have vector scopes, and this is what has me just really so excited about this camera. So Panasonic has really kind of priced this more like your budget to mid-grade full-frame camera. So Panasonic is planning some higher-end bodies. That could be insane. So I'm actually going to post in the comments my dream specs for like a Panasonic camera. Let me know your thoughts on that. Plus, I do have links to my favorite gear for the S5 II and the S5IIX in the description. And I'm actually going to be taking this camera out for some shoots later today. So check out the BTS over on IG, and I'll catch you guys soon in a new video.